it's key to get to know yourself within a professional context, and some things you can learn from others' mistakes, some things you need to experience for yourself. But you're absolutely right. I think the more you grow professionally, or part of your professional growth is also identifying where you are playing to your strengths, and it's not just skill set, it's also your style of work.
Welcome back to the I Like Networking podcast. This week, we're talking to Francesca Polo, one of our 2021 mentors. She is a certified coach and she's also the co founder of Vastari, working in the intersection between arts and technology. Today, we're going to be discussing all things about her career development, how she got to Vastari, when was the right moment to leave, how do you leave something that you built yourself, and so many more. So, without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Francesca. Welcome, Francesca, to the I Like Networking podcast. Really excited to have you here with us. You are, I think, the second Italian to be on the podcast, which is great. Um, and I would like you to just, before we start, introduce yourself to everyone. Just tell us where you're from, where you're currently based, and what is it that you do.
Okay, thanks, Isabel, for having me. It's a pleasure to share a little bit more about myself and my career so far. As you said, I'm Francesca. I am Italian, originally from Milan. I've been based in London for the last 10 years, so a bit more of a Londoner by now. And I co-founded a company that helps museums source content and source partner to tour exhibitions or build exhibitions with pieces that might not always be available to the public. And recently, well, in fact, at the beginning of last year, I decided to move on from my role as head of operations and product at Vastari, which is my company. And I have been focusing on business coaching. So I'm working with other entrepreneurs and creatives to help them structure their business in a way that works for them.
Amazing. I think so many people in the Island networking community are so interested in what you do and what Vastari does because you've especially worked a lot, I guess, in the intersection between art and tech. But you've also had quite a varied and long career and you're now doing, slightly different things. So could you just give us a bit of an overview? So did you always want to work sort of in the art world and study art? Did you have anyone in your family that did that? And how did you start your journey, I guess, in the industry?
Sure. So I'd say probably pretty much everyone in my family has a huge passion for art, but no one made it their profession. The closest we get is I have a number of cousins, probably like six out of a big number of cousins are architects, but no art historians, which is, my education was in philosophy and art history. Um, I always wanted, I'd say, to work within the creative sector. What I didn't know was how much of a passion I would have eventually developed for the tech side of things. I was lucky enough to be able to combine both sides within Vastari. So after I studied art history, as I said, I moved on to a couple of working experiences. I was at Christie's on a few different projects over time, and I was at the British Museum after that. And then I came together with my co-founder, and we realized that the private sector, namely private collectors, foundations, and corporate collections, and museums, could have really benefited from having a channel to communicate and discuss collaborations. And that's how the story came about, and where the technology was really helping to protect everyone's privacy and still broker and facilitate these connections in a democratic way, and it's a safe way, with due respect to everyone's confidentiality. From there, as the company grew, I developed more and more my interest towards tech. So well, obviously, when you start your own company, you do everything. You're a bit of a one-man band, two women band in our case, me and my co-founder. But over time, I took over the operations and product as main responsibilities. And I guess product, particularly with relation to tech, was the part I was and I still am very interested in, because it's a role that sits at the junction really between commercial awareness and understanding your market and what your clients and users want, and coming up with a creative solution in terms of product that could fulfill that need. And I find that extremely stimulating. I'm doing still quite a bit of that as part of my current job. So I consult and I'm a business coach. So with the coaching, I focus mainly on helping other entrepreneurs and creatives set goals and create structure for their business so that they feel more effectively headed towards a success or milestones that they found, rather than feeling completely overwhelmed by where the market is going or where their business is going and feeling they need to constantly catch up with it. And on the product side is all that kind of market research and going from having identified a problem to coming up with a solution and sketching out what the different steps of testing whether that's the right solution or product with various releases to market, and what sort of that roadmap would look like. So I'm still very much continuing to focus on those two areas that I developed during the 7 years I was at Vastari, just doing it in a variety of different businesses and even branching out outside of the creative industry with a few clients.
That's really interesting. I think I'm curious to know how you, because obviously you were at Vastari for a long time, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that you graduated and studied, more sort of like humanities and arts, right? So how was this process of like, did you learn everything on the go when it comes to more tech and operational stuff? I don't think people talk too much about like operational roles when it comes to the arts. I know there's a lot of it in museums, obviously, but it's not as, I guess, visible potentially. And so, how did you figure it out? Did you do a course? Did you learn everything there? How was your process over there?
Um, so you're absolutely right. That's a spot on observation. There's not a lot of kind of courses or within courses. That operations is not a subject that tends to be covered or emphasized particularly, perhaps because it's a little bit more mundane. I definitely didn't have any entrepreneurial background or education as I started Vestari, so it was very much of a steep learning curve, self educating myself partly through readings and partly just kind of a trial and error, learning on the job. I was lucky enough, and one of the reasons why I'm really, really happy to be part of well, to be here with you today and be part of the network is that mentors played a really key role in my education. So learning from and through other people's experience was a really key part. Vastari also was selected to participate in the Microsoft Ventures Accelerator back in 2014, which is well, I guess the best way to describe it would be like a crash course or a mini MBA where you are given courses and workshops, and it's quite interactive in terms of its format, and what it covers is pretty much all your bases and what you need to become an entrepreneur. I've seen over time, particularly last year, quite a lot of online courses or publications have been released on how to start your business. I guess because a lot of people were out of a job and contemplating, kind of pursuing their dreams and those side projects that have been on hold while they were absorbed by their full-time job. I'm hoping that's kind of here to stay, and that there'll be a bit more formal tools, at least to cover your bases, so that you can spare yourself some of the mistakes that I might have made in the very beginning, and obviously without having to go all in and pursue an MBA or a formal, high level education when you might not be 100% sure that you are going to be an entrepreneur for the rest of your life, or might simply not have the funds to afford to go for that type of education.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think there's definitely like not enough training, and when there is, it's not always that accessible for people, especially if you're already working, right? It's hard to make it fit around someone's schedule if you're working in a startup. And there are so many things that I think people in the art world and the creative industries can bring to like tech and vice versa. And I really hope that we see more of that interaction in the near future. But you mentioned something about making mistakes, which I think leads really well to something that I tend to always ask our um, interviewees, which is, do you have like a big career failure moment or like a really bad work experience that it's, we always learn from mistakes, so it's always an interesting thing to think about. But do you have anything that comes to mind?
Um, I guess in terms of negative work experience, um, I absolutely learned a lot by being Christie's, working within the auctioneer's world for on various projects, and it was extremely stimulating. Had access to great content and could learn a lot from seasoned professionals. I guess what I wasn't aware of or ready for was the expectation. That you might have to continue on these internships, not all of which are paid, for quite a long time before you could have a slightly more stable position. So I guess I approached it with a bit of a naivety in the beginning, and it was quite eye opening. And part actually of what led to Vastari was trying to create a bit more of an accessible and democratic ecosystem for exhibition loans in that case, but in general, bringing that world of exclusive collectors a little bit closer to the public ultimately, because by lending the work to a museum that would become accessible to the public, and by creating connections that start from the artworks rather than who you are and who you know. The idea was to democratize the whole system a little bit more. Um, so that definitely was a bit of an initial shock in my career, and something that I don't deem to be exclusively positive. Um, and in terms of failures, say, I'm taking this as more of something that I could have done differently or managed better, where I'm more responsible um, of the of things going how they did. Which wasn't obviously the case with Christie's. I think probably one of the biggest mistakes I personally made was to um, not understand early enough that it was time for me to move on from Vastari, and acknowledge that my needs had changed, my interests, and really just ending up putting myself under an incredible amount of stress. Which could have been avoided with better results for everyone involved had I been a little bit more self aware, and had I realized earlier on that I was headed to burn out, and that I needed to change something. And had I had more time to actually think about, planning that move, and think about what was best for me as well as the company, and put together a plan rather than try and make it work at all costs, I think that transition could have been a little bit smoother, not so much for the story, but for myself and my mental and physical health mainly.
Yeah. Oh my God, there's so much to unpack on your answers. I think before we had to how you decided to leave a story and how that process was, because I think that's really interesting and something that I personally really keen to hear about, because I also left like a business that I built, and I thought that this was like a to me it was like a difficult process, and I also got to burn out. So don't uh, recommend this to anyone either, but I feel like it happens more than we think.
Absolutely. And it's
But
only been discussed a little bit more in recent years, whereas
yeah,
I'm
there
sure
was
that
no.
it very much existed before as well.
Yeah, I think people just didn't use any language around it. It was like not a term that people spoke of for sure. But you said like obviously the whole free internship, like unpaid internship thing, it's definitely an issue. It's something that I am personally not a fan, especially from big organizations. If you're a volunteer led, organization, then maybe you can deal with that. But
Mhm.
I think it does create the barriers that we are now seeing in the creative industries. I mean, it's in all industries, obviously, but that's the one I know. So I'm only
Yeah,
going to talk about that one. So I don't want to put my foot on my mouth. But yeah, that's definitely a big issue. It makes a lot of people unable to afford working in that industry. And even like a lot of the salaries of these institutions are problematic if you also have to live in a city like Manhattan or London, which you did before the pandemic hit, right? I think maybe things might be a bit different right now. But You said that part of the story was, democratizing access as well, I guess, to collections and the whole thing. So could you just tell us a little bit more about how that idea came to be, how it evolved, and how more or less it operates in the
Mhm.
end? Because I don't see how, like, does Vastari has competitors? Like, I feel like you guys are doing you were doing something quite unique or specially placed in the arts network. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more how it worked for anyone who doesn't know exactly
Yeah,
about it.
sure. So, guess best starting point is that how it came about, which is that I met my co-founder back in 2012, and at the time I was at the British Museum, and she was managing a private gallery in Mayfair. And we quickly realized that we both were experiencing a very similar problem on two opposite ends. I was a researcher at the British Museum, and I was seeing myself and colleagues spending quite a bit of time trying to track provenance of specific items that could have been a good fit for upcoming exhibitions. So trying to work out who the owner would be. Specifically, I was working at the time in the prints and drawings department. So uh, some to add to the frustration of having to spend time on tracking down the current owner of work, there was also the variable that in some cases with works on paper they are especially fragile, so there's not always they're not always suitable to be lent because they might be in bad conditions or might not be able to be exposed to light for too long. So some of this research would actually at times end up going to waste in a way. When once the owner was tracked, actually we would learn that the piece could not be lent, not because the owner didn't want to, but because physically it was impossible. Um, on the other hand, my co-founder was obviously selling artworks within a private gallery, but being in Mayfair, they were around the corner from the Royal Academy, and quite often she had clients going up to the gallery and asking why they weren't made aware of a certain exhibition being planned, because they had a piece which was sold to them by the gallery that could have really been a good fit for the narrative, or was by the artist that they recently had an exhibition on, or for whatever reason they would have been interested in knowing about that show at a time when they could have been involved, because they could see some of the pieces in their collection being a good addition to that show. And so we realized that A, there wasn't a direct channel for these two parties to communicate, and B, part of the reason why that was the case was that not collectors are not necessarily always comfortable in disclosing who they are and what they own, even to a museum person. And so we thought that without having to invent any specific technology, building essentially a marketplace that would have certain visibility settings that would allow collectors to share what they have in an anonymous form and make it available only to curators that were vetted by our team before having access to these pieces, would have been pretty easy to build. And so that's exactly what we did. Vastari was born as effectively a collection management system where a collector could upload their pieces, and then one by one they could decide which ones to make available and visible to collectors. On the other end, the interface for curators requires for them to sign up and speak to our team first to verify their identity and that they work at the institution that they say they work at. And then after that, what they see is effectively a search engine that, based on the artist they select and the keywords that they use, return results for all pieces from all collections that are relevant for that search without telling them which piece is in which collection, so that there's no bias in terms of this collector actually might be better to work with because it could turn into a sponsorship of the exhibition, or we could make him a patron or whatever financial or political reasons that might be behind. But actually the relationship starts off on considerations that are purely about the artwork and less about the individuals on both ends, because equally a museum could choose not to say I am the British Museum in the first instance when they reach out to the collector. And museums also have an opportunity to disclose what they're looking for in anonymous form. Again, if they don't want to be flooded with requests, with submissions of pieces from a million collectors just because they are a top tier museum, they could simply describe what type of work they're looking for and what kind of exhibition they're working on, and um, then publish this call for entry and have collectors proactively reaching out to them. And that was launched in uh, early 2013, and from there in 2014, so pretty early on, we had a growing number of incoming requests from the museums that we were working with, saying that they were very happy to have enhanced access to collections, but they also quite frequently needed partners to either co-produce an exhibition with, or museums that would have a gap in their programming and would be willing to take on a show that was curated by another institution, and whether we could identify this type of partners for them. So we effectively built a whole second side to the marketplace where whole exhibitions can be made available and or requested. So that's more of a B2B sort of collaboration that gets facilitated. But all in all, the ecosystem works in a very synergetic way. It's effectively for museum professionals and for the private sectors to come together to build better and richer exhibitions and have them circulate more, and ultimately making more pieces available to more visitors worldwide.
That's amazing. That's such a good, oh my God, that's such a good explanation. I didn't know half of that stuff, to be honest.
I've
So,
done it a lot of times.
yeah.
I had to describe it to a lot of people, so I've now mastered my like short 5 minute description of what it is and how it came
Yeah.
about.
I bet you had to like convince people or explain to them a lot how this was gonna be, because it is not, it was like a new product, right? Like I feel like the arts are not very good at approaching tech that fast. Like,
100%. It's still an ongoing, there's a lot of education and evangelizing that we do around what we do partly, but also just kind of having a slightly different approach to um, everything really. Being a little
yeah,
bit more starting from the content, starting from the data, rather than starting from relationships, which in a way, as I was saying, kind of ties into that initial experience and dissatisfaction with
yeah,
the way things worked that I
yeah,
had at the beginning of
100%.
my career.
Friends, this is a quick break to tell you about our amazing sponsors day, and women-led company revolutionizing your periods with sustainable tampons you can be proud of. They're clinically validated, cramp-soothing CBD tampons delivered straight to your door whenever it fits your cycle. To get £5 off your first box of tampons or probiotics, just head over to yourday.com and use the code networking5. And it's, yeah, it's interesting because you did work with, places all over the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it must be a big, because I know like here in the UK a lot of museums, are this huge institutions. There's like all this funding, there's all sorts of like, government requirements, whereas, if you go to the States, everything tends to be like private. So I bet there's a lot of different systems that go through, because I can imagine, like I've interned in a museum as well, and I know how the institution, works very slowly for anything. So I bet that's a big issue. But I
Yeah, and,
am,
and it becomes even more so when you start collaborating. So not having like a common language and a standard practice and a standard operating principle to follow when you're putting together perhaps two big museums, each with their own levels of bureaucracy and processes that don't match up. It only just
yeah,
adds to the chaos.
yeah, I can imagine. So were you working like very long days and long hours at the beginning to set it all up?
Yeah, we had our fair share of long days. At the same time, both me and my co-founder were very keen on understanding and kind of advocating with our team as well that building a business, particularly within the context that we described, is much more of a marathon than it is a sprint. So if there's deadlines or if there's any time sensitive reason to give it your all, obviously you would put 100% in and do the late nights and whatever it takes to get that milestone and accomplish that goal. But otherwise, we both try to kind of preserve our energy and be able to run at full energy. If any um, unforeseen decision was to be made or things would get in the way, you want to have a high level of energy rather than consistently eating through that by doing late nights or bringing work home or working on weekends, because otherwise you can't. It's not sustainable in the long term, particularly when you're a small organization and therefore can't rely on a ton of resources both in terms of financial and talent and team.
Yeah, 100%. I feel you. So I want to now go back to your personal experience, and you mentioned that you realize now that maybe you should have left the company before. So what was happening? Can you give us a bit of an insight of what made you feel like, okay, I think I've done my fair share here, I should probably move on? Like, what was going on, and what are the signs that maybe you ignored that you shouldn't have, like that you can now identify in hindsight?
Yeah, I think just like a build-up of stress, which eventually turned into quite a lot of issues with my stomach, and which ended up being quite debilitating. And I think just the main thing was that um, I had done my fair share of work. I still and am and was very, very passionate about the business and the brand and the reason why we're doing what we're doing. But simply operationally, my role wasn't aligned with what I needed at the time anymore. I didn't have the resources and the time that I would have wanted to put in and I would have needed to put in, simply because it was just one of me and too much work. And at the same time, it wasn't necessarily feasible to delegate much or bring in an additional team member. So I felt a little bit stuck in this role where I couldn't do things at the level of, at a quality, with the quality of output that I would have wanted. Um, and and I was constantly catching up with things, and that just caused, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so it caused me a ton of stress that I didn't, as I said, handle very well, and eventually led to some health issues. So I was, once it turned into a bit of a health issue, it wasn't anything serious, and it was resolved pretty quickly after I left. But that was like the massive red flag, that I was like, I'm too young to be having health um, issues related to stress while I'm working it on something that I have built. So in a way, it's also self-inflicted stress. So I realized that just wise, I needed a bit more freedom of my time and to be able to manage projects um, in a bit more of a lean way. So at the moment, I work. Um, and I try and scope up projects beforehand so that there's extreme clarity about what my responsibility are, how I'm going to integrate with teams in case I'm working not just with a founder, and there's clear deliverables, and that kind of having those frameworks and that operationally, that structure around the project, um, it just gives me a lot more peace of mind. So then I can put in the work, and I actually don't mind, and I perform quite well when stress uh, is a component, but it's something that goes within a structured environment where I know exactly what I need to do and how. Um, because I had that kind of breathing space to build up and assess that project is best addressed and carried out in a specific way. Um, so yeah, that
Yeah.
that shift, it was massively helpful for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's funny because one thing that I always tell people when we talk, like with the island networking community, is they say that they are thinking about changing careers or changing positions, whatever. And I always ask them, okay, what is what does your ideal day look like? Like, how important is it for you to decide if you start working at 10 or at 9, or do you want to be told that you need to start at 9 every day
Mhm.
and have a place to go, etc.? Like, that's such a big thing, like how you manage your day, it impacts so much on what type of work you're going to do as well, which is, I guess, something that we, when I was younger, I didn't think about it that way. And as I got older and, started understanding what made me tick and what made some positions better than others for me, that really became a lot clearer. But it feels like part of that was parts of that was also part of your decision and how you were going to manage your career moving forwards. But you can
Absolutely.
correct me if you're wrong.
It's key to get to know yourself within a professional context, and some things you can learn from others' mistakes, some things you need to experience for yourself. But you're absolutely right. I think the more you grow professionally, or part of your professional growth is also identifying where you are playing to your strengths, and it's not just skill set, it's also your style of work, and what, where you can reach optimal performance and how much you can negotiate from there, or you're willing to negotiate from your ideal setup for a specific position, or whether you're absolutely not willing to negotiate and you're only going to work on your own terms.
Yeah. And so, but how then you decided to do the pivot itself? Were you doing a course in between, or did you quit and then start thinking about what you were going to do? How was that like transition? I feel like that's something really important right now. As you said, a lot of people are starting their own businesses. Lots of people are considering a career change right now. So
Mhm.
that would be, I guess, really helpful for anyone on that path.
Um, I obviously had to plan my transition because Vastari was still relying on me pretty significantly at the time when I decided to leave, even though obviously it wasn't completely dependent. So it was, I successfully managed to transition out. There was obviously a conversation to be had with my co founder, my investors, and my team about that. I had already, well before I knew that I was even remotely approaching burnout, on the side, studied and qualified as a coach. So that sort of credential was already part under my belt at the time when I decided to move on. And I never thought that I would move from Vastari into working for someone. So that's just something that wasn't even remotely in my head. So it kind of quite naturally, the next step was going to be to work for myself, but more as an independent consultant and coach rather than as an entrepreneur with a team and investors and a company. Um, and in terms of the areas of focus, obviously, networking and being in the world, in the sector for 7 years, meant that I had a lot of relationship, and quite organically, I managed to find a few people to work with. Obviously, I'm not in any way providing services that compete with Vastari, so I'm working with some people that I've known for a long time, but in an entirely different and new capacity, which is also quite a nice way to discover other sides of each other, I'm assuming, professionally. And then I guess because the last year has been such a wild card, so far I've very much relied on word of mouth, and rather than doing any sort of formal marketing and outreach efforts to publicize my services, and it's worked actually really fine. I've had a good amount of clients, considering that 2020 was the way it was, and it's been incredibly rewarding as well to support other entrepreneurs at a time that for everyone was quite difficult to face, regardless of that there's been some clients that actually realized that their operation weren't as solid as they thought because they saw a massive increase in demand of the service or product that they were providing, and there were clients that were actually struggling because most of their clients uh, find uh, couldn't find a way to justify paying for their product or service, in light of the financial climate and struggle of last year. So they had to either repackage or pivot or think about ways of staying afloat or making the business more sustainable. So it was a very different challenges and very different sort of mindsets that we had to work on. But it's yeah, I think it's been incredibly rewarding, and really felt like the right decision in light of the last year and how much fulfillment, happiness, and peace of mind I had despite everything that was going on in the world.
Yeah, I love that. I was definitely going to ask about how the first clients came, but I had a hunch it was going to be around your network because obviously that helps, right? I feel like a lot of people become consultants after having a lot of experience somewhere because that makes the transition a lot smoother, especially right now. As you said,
Yeah,
it's a
and in
difficult
our
time.
industry as well. I feel
Yeah.
like now, just at the beginning of this year, I'm starting to branch out in different directions and dipping my toes in industries that are not under the large umbrella of the cultural sector, which pose other and different challenges, and I'm finding that very stimulating. But it's yeah, it's absolutely being vital to be able to start from my own network and start within the industry, um, in order for that transition to guarantee me a little bit of continuity on the one hand and on financial stability on the other hand.
Yeah. I think it would be sorry. I wanted to ask you if you had any difficulty at any point pricing yourself or negotiating with people. I feel like that's a question we get a lot. We're actually running an event about that as well because it's a lot of people who are freelancers or solopreneurs or
Hmm.
coaches or going on their own find that the most difficult part about how do you, because when you're working for yourself, it's almost how you're putting a value on your own work yourself, which can
Hmm.
be a challenge for people. Did you ever deal with any of that? And if not, how do you go about negotiating your rates? Are you really strict? Do you have strategies that work well for you? Is that something that you are comfortable with?
Um, yeah, fairly comfortable. I have to say, I came to to coaching and to consulting with quite a bit of confidence in my knowledge and expertise. So in that sense, having also obviously done a little bit of research around market rates and budgets of the type and size of companies that I wanted to work with, I came up with a figure. I'm fairly strict when it comes to my rate in terms of I don't negotiate that very much. What I have had to offer, and I'm also, regardless to all the challenges of last year, I'm always very willing, particularly working with a lot of entrepreneurs and startup and understanding where they come from, to discuss flexible payment terms. So if they can't afford the full fee straight away, but my work is going to help them um, reach a specific milestone or close a round of funding, I'm happy to do delayed payment or KPI based fees that or bonuses. So I'm quite happy to creatively think about how much how those funds will be delivered over time. But um, in terms of the net worth of the work, I try and be fairly strict. And I think that I do that for two reasons. One, because I value my work, but I also feel that it happens unfortunately a lot within the creative sector. But if you try and be almost too competitive with your pricing, you are doing a disservice to all your colleagues, and it becomes a race to the bottom. And then even companies that could afford to pay more, if the average tends to go lower and lower because everyone is trying to be competitive on pricing, then you end up with a lot of creatives that are starving and struggling to pay bills, and a lot of companies that assume that that's the market rate. So as soon as they come up with someone that come up against almost someone that is trying to stand their ground and commanding a fee that is probably more appropriate to their service, they are immediately labeled as being absolutely too pricey or unreasonable. And I do think that the creatives are more often than not remunerated appropriately for their services. So whenever I can, I'm also sort of advocating and encouraging other creatives or consultants. I mean, I'm lucky that pitching myself as a consultant, even though I work within the industry, typically and immediately you would associate that job title with higher fees. So I struggle with that a bit less. But my partner, for example, is a designer, and I see that happening all the time within that specific niche of the sector. People trying to bid for, branding projects, or even just creating a logo, trying to be as cheap as possible rather than trying to explain to a client what is behind the final product and why it's costed the way it is, because there's a lot of work that goes behind it in terms of research, your self-education. As a freelancer, you need to pay for your also own business development time. You, in my case, I also price things to be able to afford having a set amount of hours per month that I can dedicate pro bono to work with charities, because it's something that is really important to me. So there's all these considerations that financially, on the one hand with expertise, on the other hand with cost, lead you to your figure. And I always suggest that whoever the freelancer or solo entrepreneur is tries to explain that and put it into context for the client rather than immediately trying to discount their fees.
Yeah, 100%. I think you hit it really in the head there with the management and research and how, that is definitely, I think I agree with you a lot. Most creatives don't get priced fairly for their business. I feel like there's this weird notion that because it's a creative role, then you can exchange it for like bread and peanuts, whereas
Mm-hmm.
like you still need money to pay your bills, right? Because we don't exist in this other world. But it's definitely something that I see it happening a lot. So thank you for that and for being so honest with us. I think I need to start wrapping up. I know because I took a lot
Mm-hmm.
of your time already. So I'm really glad that you're going to be a mentor this year. I think a lot of people will learn a lot from you as well. And I'd love to know, and you can select this um, question, which one you want to answer, or both. Okay, either the advice you give your younger self, or the worst career advice you've ever received, and you're happy that you didn't take.
Um, yeah, I guess probably the worst career advice is I have a more immediate answer coming to mind, so I'll go for that one purely because I won't keep you waiting. Um, and it's been like, choose a career path that is going to pay you well and it's safe. And I feel, in light of last year, but in general, with the direction the job market is headed, that's such an obsolete point of view and advice, because there's no real stability anymore. It's not. I think we've reached a point where your career path is not a linear trajectory, and you might, in fact, even just start thinking of multiple career paths, plural. Um, I see that happening more and more within and outside the creative industry. So I think just actually keeping your mind open, knowing your strengths, and doing something you're passionate about, even though it sounds very um, kind of not extremely pragmatic, actually does pay off, because you're going to start building a network in the areas that matter for you, and then you can start kind of building on top of that rather than aiming to do something that you might not be passionate about, and investing a lot of time in your education and starting to do a job that, within a few years you are going to end up not liking, and then having to start asking yourself what you want to do then. That actually puts you at in a very bad position in terms of competitive advantage, a lot more so than perhaps dipping your toes in multiple ponds and testing waters on multiple levels from the outset, potentially building multiple career paths before choosing to specialize in one, or keeping all those channels open.
100%. I love that taste, Francesca. That's good. I actually am stealing that question because I heard it today from someone else, and I thought it was such a good. That was like everyone gave such good answers. I was like, okay, I'm gonna incorporate that now. Like the advice you didn't follow, but I think before we wrap up, would you tell us how can people connect with you? How can they reach out to you? What are you looking for if they reach out to you? How can people work with you, businesses or solopreneurs? Give us the whole spiel. Give us your elevator pitch.
Right. So as I said, I now work as a consultant and coach. My company is called Curated Success. That's curated-success.com. Um, and I work mainly with entrepreneurs and freelancers. So most of my work is done one-on-one, and I help them identify the best structure or the structure that is missing in their business if they are finding themselves that in a business where things aren't going how they want them to. And it's fairly high level as a pitch, but it's part of what I want from my profession right now is actually to work with a diverse pool of clients, and it's paid off. It just this kind of short description resonates with some, and those are the people that I'd love to connect with. They can email me at Francesca at curated-success.com. Curated Success is also my Instagram handle, and typically for coaching we would do an intro session where we explore what the main issues are and what the outcomes or deliverables would be, and then we would agree on how to set up the work. And with consultancy, similarly we have an initial discussion, because the areas in which I can help are quite broad, and it also depends if I'm going to work with a company. It depends on the talent that they have in house, where I might be of help. I'm always happy and open-minded if it's a committed person, and if it's an interesting business, we tend to find a way to work together. So I'd say the best way is to just reach out and check if we are a good fit. And then if that's the case, in my experience, we tend to find a way to work together.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Francesca. I really appreciate having you on the podcast. Really happy that you're part of the program. And I'm hoping we can meet in person soon somewhere in this crazy world. Maybe even in a museum. We'll see at some point.
Absolutely. That'd be the dream. And thanks for having me. And I look forward to meeting the mentees and hopefully connecting with people after the podcast goes live.
Yes, for sure. Thank you for listening to the Eyeline Networking podcast. For more information on everything that we do, just head over to our website, eyelinenetworking.uk, or find us on social media. Now, if you're looking for more stories from inspiring entrepreneurs, check out the Serial Entrepreneurs from Startups Magazine, a print and digital publication that champions tech startups. Here, their editor Anna Flockett interviews the most innovative startups of the moment with some startup lessons and failure fables, as well as a sprinkling of inspirational advice. You can find them by searching the Serial Entrepreneur, as in your breakfast, into any streaming service, or by going to startupsmagazine.co.uk. See you next week.